Hey, you guys, this episode of Otherppl is brought to you by Audible, the world's leading provider of digital audio books. Over at Audible.com, there are hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of titles to choose from in a wide variety of genres, and you can play them on just about any digital listening device that you can hold in your hand, whether it's an iPhone, a Kindle, an Android, etc. And here's the deal. Right now, for listeners of this program, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial. Go get The Voice Is All, The Lonely Victory of Jack Kerouac, the new biography by today's guest, Joyce Johnson. And while you're at it, get yourself a Jack Kerouac novel. Just about any book at Audible can be yours free of charge. And if you do this, if you go get the freebie, it helps the program. I get a few nickels. That is pleasant. To download your free audiobook, just go to audibletrial.com/otherpeople. Again, that's audibletrial.com/otherpeople. This is a terrific deal. It is available right this moment. These are books. You can listen to them. Go and get them. Oh my God.
You are not alone. You have found other people.
You and I have a friend in common.
Every stupid thing that a writer could do, I've done.
I think it's really beautiful.
Jesus, dude, what a struggle, you know?
It was incredible. You know, it's like your head exploded seeing what was really there.
And now here's your host, Brad Listi.
Just one person at just one time.
Right.
Okay, everybody, here we go again. This is it. This is Otherppl. This is two human beings having a word with one another. This is you having a word with yourself. Thanks for being here. My name is Brad Listi, and I'm in Los Angeles. What is happening? Doubt is happening here. Doubt has been on my mind this week, the past couple of days. Self-doubt or some form of it. And, you know, it's not a negative thing that I'm referring to here. It's actually a positive thing, I think, this form of self-doubt. So often, I think when we talk about this, when we talk about doubting ourselves, it's considered negative. People tell you not to do it. Like, don't doubt yourself, have confidence in you know, yourself and so on. But this week, I've been thinking about my own thinking. I've been thinking about what I think about. And in particular, I've been considering how certain I can often feel about my own perceptions. Like my beliefs about people and things and situations and phenomena, but especially people. You know how it is, the judgments that you make in your own brain and how harsh they can sometimes be, or how sweeping and seemingly permanent, how damning. So, you know, in this particular context, it occurs to me that I would be well served by doubting more often. And I should mention that I got into this train of thought as I was reading The Voice Is All, the Kerouac biography by today's guest, Joyce Johnson. This is something that Jack Kerouac wrote. I believe he wrote it in a letter to a friend, or else he said it, but I think he wrote it. And he encouraged this friend of his to doubt his own mind more often, to doubt his judgments. And it sort of stuck to me. Because, you know, we're all people at the end of the day, and our perceptions tend to be flawed. We're all confused. And the things that people do or don't do, it's complex. It's rarely simple. And I think that much of the time, the things that we think we know definitively, we probably don't really know all that well at all. I don't know if I just said that right. So that's where my head has been. And, the other day, just 48 hours ago, in a fit of enthusiasm with this new approach, I told myself that I should be more scientifically detached, more zen about what goes on in my brain. And I told myself that from now on, I should doubt every single thought that goes through my head, reserving judgment. But then, as I pondered this a little bit more, and as logic would seem to indicate, I told myself that I should doubt my decision to doubt everything. Like, if you're going to doubt your thoughts and you're really going to follow through, then shouldn't you doubt the preceding thought about wanting to doubt everything? Like, is that really a good idea? Should I be doubting What I'm saying is that I got into a spiral. And then it started to get confusing again. This is what I do. I haven't sorted it all out yet, obviously, but I want you to know that I'm working on it. So a big show for you today. It's another double feature, and there's a lot to get to. I want to start with Joshua Moore. He's been a guest on this program before. I believe it was last year. He's got a new novel out. It is called Fight Song, and it is the February selection of the TNB Book Club, the Nervous Breakdown Book Club. And thenervousbreakdown.com is, of course, my online culture magazine and literary community. If you're not familiar with it and you're not familiar with the book club, it's a wonderful deal, and you should join. For only $9.99 a month, you get a brand new book delivered to your door every 30 days. The titles are hand-selected by me and by Jonathan Evison. And better yet, all of the book club authors appear on this program. So you can read the book, and then you can hear me talk to the person who wrote the book. And again, it's only $9.99 a month. That's less than the cost of a book. And that's less than the cost of a movie ticket in most cities. And in some places, it's less than the cost of an alcoholic beverage. So it's an authentically good deal. And if you want to sign up, just go to thenervousbreakdown.com and click on Book Club in the menu bar. You can pay safely and securely with PayPal or with any major credit card. It's very easy, and I should add that it helps me keep this show in operation. So if you're interested, if you want a new book every 30 days for less than the cost of a book, please go do that and join the club. So let's get on with the first part of the show, my conversation with Joshua Moore, a fine gentleman and a fine writer, and his new novel, once again, is called Fight Song, and it is available now from Soft Skull Press.
This is Joshua Moore, and I'm coming to you live from the Mission District of San Francisco. It is a beautiful, sunny afternoon, and I'm doing the dishes with one shoe on for some reason. I don't know why that happened.
You only have one shoe on?
I only have one shoe on. I was kind of getting dressed, and then I felt like I had to do some obligatory things, and here I stand.
Here you stand. What kind of shoe is it? Just as a basic tennis shoe, or is it some sort of elaborate boot? Or
it is. It would be even weirder if it was a cowboy boot. But this is just like a low top Chuck Taylor with an Argyle sock on the other foot.
Okay. And congratulations on the book. I should start there at least. This is number 4, right?
This is number 4, yeah. It's like way uncharted territory for me, so I'm really looking forward to seeing what people are seeing in this script.
Well, okay, because I think we actually touched upon this last time because you were in process on Fight Song when we talked, I believe, on the Damascus publicity cycle, and you said that this was a departure for you. It was like more of like a, I don't know, there was more sunshine maybe in this one than there were in past books. Like, is that?
Well, I think with the Bar trilogy is kind of just dealing with like addicts and weird artists, and with this one, I set out to write a black comedy, and then kind of the question that launched the whole thing was, what would happen if I tried to tell the Wizard of Oz set in a 21st century American suburb? And that was kind of my point of entry, and I just had a blast putting this book together. It was really fun.
And then what about like the suburbs? Is this something that you have, because you live in San Francisco, you know what I'm saying? You live in this urban environment, but were you raised in suburbs? Did you have some kind of like quintessential American suburban childhood or something that gave you entree to this world?
God, I hope that my childhood was not the quintessential American one. But I did, after kind of some like rocky years in Arizona, I did spend my junior high and high school out in a Bay Area suburb. So I have some firsthand experience then. And I've lived in San Francisco for about 18 years, so I felt it was, to do my due diligence, I went on some like research projects and went to some like atrocious suburbs right around here, a couple in the East Bay, a couple in the South Bay. And then I took some photos and some notes, and then I went home and built kind of my perfect nightmarish suburb.
I was going to say, like, it would be almost great if, like, you wrote the entire novel. You should maybe try to build this into the mythology of the book, that you wrote the entire thing in an Applebee's or something. Like that was your cat.
I know, right? I had like I was wearing like shorts and Jerry Seinfeld sneakers and had a fanny pack on.
You went like totally in character,
I mean, you have to. You just have to embrace it. That's why I shaved a bald spot on the back of my head. It was perfect.
So do you find, I mean, it seems like people who publish as well and as frequently as you do, you don't get too hung up on the psychological or emotional mechanics of the publication process and the review process. But do you have, as each subsequent book comes out, do you find yourself getting better at dealing with this part of it, like the nerves and the wondering about the reviews and what will sales do? Like, how do you manage all that? And like, has it gotten any easier?
It has definitely gotten easier. And one of the ways that I manage it is I'm always deep into the next project when one is kind of hitting the shelves. So I can always like take sanctuary and can always find solace in the creative process, because that's really what I like. I mean, sure, I like to read a positive book review. I mean, everybody likes, to have their ego stroked a little bit. But the reason that I like to write books are like the micro pleasures. I write because writing makes my Thursday better. Writing makes my Sunday better. Writing makes my Monday better. And if I can really kind of like attune myself in kind of that part of the writing identity, that's really what I do this for.
So how does it make it better? You know what I'm saying? Like, how does it make your Sunday better? Can you drill down into that some more?
Oh, I can, absolutely. I mean, I'm kind of a rabid insomniac, so my day sort of ends and begins with writing. So it's kind of like the last flavor in my mouth as I kind of like, quote unquote, shut down. And then oftentimes, I haven't really slept, and it's 6 or 7 in the morning, and I have to kind of brew some coffee and get going on my teaching responsibilities. And I really find that if I've had time in my kind of imaginative ecosystem, if I've had time to kind of play with my imaginary friends, that makes the rest of my status quo make a lot more sense. Because, what I'm typically preoccupied with on the page is the same kind of preoccupations that I have in my everyday life. So they really kind of balance each other, and I think they really bounce off of one another, and hopefully inform each other in a way that I'm going to make kind of better decisions in my own day-to-day life.
And then what about, like, do you ever sit there and say, I might be all tapped out? Like, do you ever find yourself wondering if you're going to run out of material, or how do you keep yourself like heavily invested in the next thing? Do you know what I'm saying? Do you have like a method, or do you have an approach to it that feels concrete?
Well, what has worked for me so far creatively is that I'm always working on 2 books at once. There's one like way later in the drafting process, which I find exercises a very different part of my psyche, versus something that's very nascent, something where I'm just kind of like writing those initial gusts of imagination, and I really have no idea what the fuck the book is going to turn into yet. I'm just kind of experimenting and embracing kind of the trial and error of it all. I mean, so far I haven't had any sort of writer's block. I would imagine that if you're lucky enough to have a long career, that's going to be something that you have to deal with eventually. But so far I've got enough ideas in the queue to keep me busy for a few years. Sure.
And then in the intervening months since we last spoke, you have gotten married. So congratulations on that.
Yeah, I got married in August. Yeah, thanks very much. It was really super fun. It was a very small wedding. There was only about 30 of us there. But I got to tell you, Brad, I bawled like a baby the whole entire time. Like, as soon as I saw her turn the corner in that dress, I was just done for.
That was it.
I lost it. And then it was like, I thought that was going to be the worst part, and I'd like get my shit together. But then, a friend of ours, Bucky Sinister, wrote and read an original poem. Then a friend of ours got up and sang a song. Then the vows. I just kept crying like more and more ferociously. And by the end of it, I was just like, I had like no dignity left whatsoever. It was just one of those things. Maybe that's a metaphor for how it's all going to go down anyways, right?
So might as well start letting go now. But it does bring up an interesting question. Like, I'm dealing with this. I have a kid now too, which adds like another layer. But it's writing is such a solitary pursuit, and I remember it's easy to like idealize those early years when you were single and it was just you and your shitty apartment, and you had a lot fewer responsibilities to other people,
right.
And you were able to kind of focus and zero in. Like, how do you find yourself managing that kind of balance? Has it made it easier? Has it made it harder? Do you find it like more fulfilling to get to write when you have? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, how does it all work for you that way?
It's funny that you mentioned that too, because when I think back to writing as a single bloke, like I have a very hard time idealizing that sense because I was a drug addict.
Oh, right.
And I was like either like popping oxy or like doing a couple grams of cocaine just to like kind of get myself to the keyboard at all. So kind of when I think about those times writing, like those were much more unhappy times. And when I think about the way I write now, what's so cool about it is my wife is an incredibly good and avid sleeper. So, I'll lay down with her about 11 o'clock and, she's usually typically out in half an hour, 45 minutes. Then I'll get up and I'll get to work about midnight and I'll write until I have nothing else to say that night. So I actually find that it's actually working out better so far. We're expecting a baby in June.
Oh, you are?
I expect that to completely dismantle my creative output.
I didn't know
we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
I had no idea, man. Congratulations. Yeah,
so that will be, our uncharted waters are about to get a whole lot more uncharterable, if that's not a word.
Yeah, no, it's really, it's a huge change. Like a friend of mine said one time, and this is like something I always kind of like repeat, but it's like having, like the difference between having a kid and not having a kid is like pre 9/11 and post 9/11, which is sort of it's a crude way to put it, but it's sort of, I find that there's a ring of truth to it.
What's really cracks me up, though, is everybody who tries to find some sort of analogy or some sort of metaphor, it always has to do with, like, apocalypse or annihilation.
Well, you know what it is? This is the other thing I always say, is that I always, like, jokingly congratulate friends of mine who are getting ready to have their first kid by saying, welcome to a state of permanent fear. Because, like, it's so great. I mean, there's nothing better. And, like, I don't think, I have a friend who is single. He's about my age. He lives a completely different life. We were just talking about this. He was saying basically that he has no desire to ever get married and have kids because he gets to do whatever he wants, and he likes being single. He likes that life. And you know what? Like, there's no right way to live your life. There's different roads you can take. So I'm not. Sure. I would never think to judge that. But one thing I will say is that, like, unless you have a kid, as far as I can tell, like, I know personally, like, I don't think you can really know, and this is going to sound, I don't want to sound too precious about it, but I don't think you can really know what love is until you have a child. Because adult relationships, as great as they can be, they're always a little bit fraught, or at least there's a sliver of possibility that they can be fraught or breakable. But, when you have a kid, if you're, semi-well adjusted, that's a pretty unbreakable feeling. Yeah. I don't think I could replicate that otherwise. I don't know. Maybe people feel differently.
Well, I wonder too that if you're an author who doesn't have kids, am I always writing from the perspective of a child, even when I'm pretending to be a parent? Like, it'll be really interesting to see, like, once I have kids, to kind of read back on which I pretended to be a parent when I didn't actually have children, and to see if it registered with any sort of, like, sincerity or earnestness.
Did you? I mean, because like you do sort of prepare. I mean, it's something like you think about from childhood almost, at least in bursts or in moments. You imagine what it would be like to have kids of your own, or if you're ever going to do that. Especially people, I think, who are predisposed to do it. Like I always thought of myself as one day having kids, and there are people I know who never thought of themselves as having kids. Like,
right.
Is this something you always thought you were going to do, or are you surprised to be sitting here waiting for your first child?
I think like post sobriety, I always thought that having a kid would be cool. But when I was still, drinking and drugging, I never wanted to bring somebody into like the kind of chaos that I was raised in. I never wanted to like have somebody that I was like experiencing kind of that set of world. But now that like I kind of got my shit together marginally, and I feel the space too. That I think it would be really fun and a new kind of exciting set of adventures to try to tackle.
Well, and dude, you're already an insomniac, so you're like perfect for this. You're already not sleeping. You might as well be rocking an infant.
It's funny too. Like I already am in like a fugue state, like at least 14 hours a day. So what's the difference if I have a little like throw up on my shirt?
Right. That's it. Well, that's exciting. That's really exciting, and that's coming in June. Do you know if it's a boy or a girl?
Yeah, we just just found out a couple weeks ago. We're having a little girl.
You're having a little girl. Oh, see, I'm partial. I have a little girl, so that's little girls love their dads. So you're in good shape.
And how old is yours?
She's like 2.5.
Awesome.
Yeah. So that's very exciting. And you got the 4th book out. You're working on the 5th book. Do we have any like hints on what the next one is?
Yeah, it's always kind of too soon for me to tell. I know that I wanted to try to do something kind of similar to the Great World. Let the Great World Spin did something really fun for New York City, and I was thinking it might be kind of fun to try to do something like that for San Francisco, and using the Golden Gate Bridge as kind of the conduit to tell kind of like the social history of San Francisco, which is so rich and is so unique. To kind of use some sort of a tragedy or some sort of like weird madcap calamity on the Golden Gate Bridge as a framing device, and pop back and forth through a bunch of different stories and a bunch of different psyches. Fight Song is a very streamlined book, and I often find that I'm kind of writing my next book in response to what has come right before it. Damascus was really sprawling, so kind of Fight Song is just one perspective and kind of like a very personality or voice-driven story. I think for the next one, I'll get back into more of the messy mosaic style storytelling where all hell is breaking loose with a bunch of different characters, and you don't really know as the book starts how they're all going to tie together. But if I do my job right, they'll all sort of converge near the climax.
Wow. Well, and the Golden Gate Bridge is fascinating. Like not only from like just as a feat of engineering, but all the jumpers and there's just I don't know. There's something really magical and captivating and about it. Like I don't know the history all that well, but
I know because it was built in the 30s too, and we're coming out of the Depression, we're kind of coming out of Prohibition, and if I was to kind of follow that up until relatively recently, and I feel like I could tell almost the whole social history of SF, like just using the bridge as that framing device. And the really cool thing that I found out, actually, I was reading this yesterday, I was doing some research, is that there's so many people still out of work because of the Depression that there's kind of this line of guys waiting for somebody to fall off, and then somebody would like crash into the safety net, and it was like 50 feet down. So even if they didn't die, they were still kind of really injured. And then the next person would just kind of go out there, which is like such a surreal image from my perspective. Like I'm really curious to see how that plays out on the page.
Have you been like doing like archival research and looking at photos of the bridge and construction and stuff like that?
Yeah, because out of San Francisco State, they have a huge, huge archive of footage, and it's been really fun to just go through all of those photos and read all the kind of the records and whatnot. I don't know if you know Patrick DeWitt, who wrote The Sisters Brothers, but he was telling me that when he was starting to research that book, he bought a picture book that was set in kind of the gold rush time, and that was the only research he did. He didn't actually like kind of go through, any like archival footage or whatnot. He was just kind of using these like pictorial points of reference and then just kind of turning his imagination loose. And now that I'm trying to like do something about on my own, like it really makes me appreciate that Pat was able to do that. Because I would never be able to do something like that. I really want to like dive into the nuances and dive into kind of the idiosyncrasies of what those men and women experienced.
But wait, so what you're saying is that like his understanding what he did for the Sisters Brothers has given you the confidence to do something similar with this book, or do you feel like you're going to be taking a different route?
Well, I was just kind of like in awe that he was able to kind of give himself permission to like look at these photographs and say, "Cool, I'm just going to like make it up from here." And I just think it's fascinating how as authors we're basically all trying to do the same job. Like, and our job is to tell a compelling story. And it's so interesting that we'll all take such like wildly different avenues to go about accomplishing that feat. Well, I don't know, that kind of stuff kind of excites me.
Well, yeah, and it's also like, it's an interesting point is that it's like a situation where, you're trying to kind of negotiate the tension between wanting to have some allegiance to historical fact, but also giving yourself permission to just make stuff up. And I think sometimes as writers of fiction, it can be easy to kind of get caught in that trap of telling yourself that you need to do more research before you can start. I don't know enough yet to start. And or you can feel like, I have to hew closer to the actual historical record in order to do justice to these people. But, you also have to give yourself permission at some point to just kind of leap and start making stuff up, which is a big part of what we do.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about my first 4 books, that I was like intentionally trying to evade that whole kind of research disaster. So I was just basically writing about kind of like my own like shitty life experiences and like my friends' shitty life experiences, and kind of like stitching novels together that way. But it finally felt time to try to maybe push myself in a different direction. All my books are kind of set in contemporary times, and maybe it was a good moment to kind of look backward and see what it might be to have to like occupy a whole other zeitgeist. I mean, I think that would present a really interesting challenge.
Well, and it also sounds to me, I mean, like you said, you've it's not like you've lived there your whole life, but San Francisco is home. You've been there for almost 20 years. And so It's almost like, and I sort of relate to this with Los Angeles, because I moved around a lot and then have suddenly found myself here for almost, I guess I'm pushing towards 15 years at this point. But it's like experiencing a sense of rootedness, or kind of staking a claim to a place and saying that this is home. And I think as a writer, I think it's sort of nice to have a place as a writer,
Well, with my first 3 books, they were all set in the Mission District, like all on the Valencia Quarter. Like, these were the places that when I go out of my apartment, I'm walking by all of these things. So even Fight Song, like just setting it out in a suburb of the Bay Area, like felt like a huge leap of faith. I was like, what do I really know about this ecosystem, or what do I really know about these people? And I didn't want to just like write the kind of satire where I'm like looking down my nose at them and kind of like laughing hysterically. Like I wanted to write the kind of satire where I'm like occupying their consciousnesses sincerely and really telling kind of their plights with like an open heart, rather than just kind of like skewering them like, Stephen Colbert, or kind of like that ilk. I wanted to really kind of have the kind of satire in which we'll be able to see ourselves. Like certainly a cautionary tale in Fight Song, but I didn't want it to be too acerbic.
Right. Well, I congratulate you on it, man. It's impressive. The 4th book, and you're still a young man, right? Yeah. Like I don't even know how old you are, but you seem about my age. So I don't know.
How old are you?
37, pushing 38.
Yeah, absolutely. We're right in the same zone.
But congratulations on it. So you've had a big year. New book, new wife, and now new fetus. So, best of luck with everything. Congratulations, and thanks so much.
It's funny, I was just joking with someone the other day that like so much good stuff has happened in the last 7 or 8 months, and I'm kind of just waiting for a piano to fall on my head as I'm walking down the street.
Right.
Don't you think it's really sick how like as humans, if things are going well, we're just waiting for something terribly dangerous to happen? Well, where does that come from?
I'm the same way. I think it's just, I think it has something to do with my self-concept. It has something to do with maybe being raised Catholic. It has something to do with like some sense of the law of averages. But I think I know people who don't have that. I think I know people who might be just like more genetically predisposed to having a sunny disposition and just accepting good fortune happily, without any kind of like, internal sense of counterbalance or looming danger. I don't know what it is.
That sounds like a whole other world in which like there are like unicorns running down the middle of the street.
Yeah,
that must be a really fun way to live. Like I'm kind of envious of that.
I know. Maybe someday. Maybe someday we can write about characters like that to try to figure out who the hell they are.
Yeah, now that would almost be science fiction, my friend. For sure.
Well,
how do you talk about these happy people?
Yeah, I mean, I think about I'm thinking in particular about my old roommate, who is just like, it's almost like a competitive thing. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's just like a relentless cheerfulness that does not abate. And we lived together for like 4 years, like platonically as roommates. And I am not that way, in case you weren't aware. I like to consider myself like ultimately an optimist, but like I have to work through all sorts of pessimism to get there or something. It's just more complicated. It's not nearly like as clean and pure as her version of happiness or whatever. But
we were talking about, like, waiting for reviews and whatnot. And a friend said to me, we had a big party for the book last night in the Mission, and a friend said to me afterward, like, well, because the reviews are starting this weekend, and the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle come out on Sunday, and she goes, well, maybe if you just put a lot of, like, positivity out in the world. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, what do you mean put positivity? And she goes, well, just, think to yourself, like, I'm really happy about this book, and I hope that other people see what I'm trying to accomplish. She's like, just try to say that as a mantra, throughout the whole day. So I tried it this morning, and even though I'm in my apartment, completely alone, with one shoe on, like, I still feel self-conscious about that. I can't just say something like that aloud or even think it to myself. It just feels too weird.
Yeah, I'd have to see. This is the kind of thing where I would want someone else to be a test case. Like, I need some proof that this is going to work before I'm going to start going down that road. I can't take myself seriously doing that kind of stuff. The affirmations.
You have to, like, put on your emotional lab coat, and really, like, get into your laboratory and see what's going on, yeah?
I think so. Well, I wish you the best of luck with it, man. And I congratulate you. And, hopefully we cross paths before too long.
Yeah, I'll be down your way for the Maritime Festival of Books, so let's get a cocktail.
For sure, man. Take it easy.
Always a pleasure, Brad. Thanks.
Okay, so there's Mr. Moore, Joshua Moore. Go get his new book. It is called Fight Song. It is out there now from Soft Skull. It is a wonderful novel that is generating critical acclaim. And speaking of critical acclaim, my next guest is Joyce Johnson. She is the author of a new biography of Jack Kerouac. It is also generating critical acclaim. It is called The Voice Is All, The Lonely Victory of Jack Kerouac. It is published by Viking, and it's a wonderful book that offers a very interesting perspective on Kerouac's life, his work, and better yet, Joyce actually knew him. She knew Jack Kerouac. She went on a blind date with him in the 1950s. That's how they met. You're going to get to hear all about that in just a moment. But my point is, she has a unique insight into who he was and how he worked, and I'm thrilled to get to share this conversation with you. So here she is, ladies and gentlemen. This is Joyce Johnson, the author of The Voice Is All.
I am in my apartment on the Upper West Side, and my immediate surroundings, one large room with some abstract expressionist paintings that were done by my two late husbands, who were both painters, and lots of books, of course, and lots of plants, and big windows looking out on Columbus Avenue on buildings with, red walls like Edward Hopper paintings.
Sounds lovely.
It is lovely.
So, and it sounds like a good New York apartment. I mean, you always hear horror stories, but this sounds like you're in a good spot.
I am. I love this place. Yeah.
Well, I want to begin with, I guess, a little bit of background. You knew Jack Kerouac, and maybe we can start there. Why don't you talk about how you knew him, how you fell in with the Beats, that period of your life, just so we can get kind of a foundation for everything else.
Sure. Well, it all happened back in the late 50s. I was going to Barnard College from 1951 to 55, and hanging out with a group of older people who were, in graduate school or teaching, and these were people who had connections with the Beats because they'd been at Columbia at the same time as Allen Ginsberg, and when Jack Kerouac was also around the campus. And so I met Allen actually at a party when I was 16 years old, and at one party even William Burroughs passed through on his way to Tangier. But I didn't meet Jack at that time. I met him in January 1957, and it was a blind date set up by Allen Ginsberg, because Allen always looked out for Jack, and Jack was in New York, back from California, and penniless, and didn't have a place to live. And I was one of those rare young women who had her own apartment. So I was very excited about meeting Jack because I had just read his first novel, The Town and the City. I was working for a literary agency at that time, MCA, and they had briefly been Jack's agents, and they were discarding a lot of books by former clients. So I took that book and went home to read it, and yeah, it was very hard in those days for young women, especially, to leave home. It was, if you did that, it was assumed you were a really bad girl, up to no good, and there were rifts with your family. So it was a hard time for me, and the book, that particular novel, captured for me a lot of the feelings I had about, striking out for myself and cutting loose from my family. Really, I felt it was really speaking to me in a very direct way, and it was gorgeously written. So I was very excited about meeting Jack, and he called me one night and asked if I would come down and meet him at a counter in Howard Johnson's, and said he would be sitting at the counter wearing a red and black check shirt. So I walked in, and there he was, and we were both sort of shy people, but we really hit it off right away.
So tell me about these guys back then, like Alan, Jack, first impressions, and then from there, and then beyond. Like, what were they like? And I don't know, try to give us a sense of who they really were, because we all have, so many of us who've read these books have a sense of who they are based on that. But, what were they actually like in person?
Well, Alan was, a very exciting person, very intense, and filled with a real drive to change the world. When that movie of Howl came out, and Alan was played by James Franco, I thought they made a big mistake in reading Howl in a kind of soft, elegiac way. We're really, at the time that Alan wrote it and first started giving readings of it, it was a polemic, an indictment, against society, a desire to change things. And that spirit just seemed to be missing from the way that poem was interpreted. I thought that was a pity. And Jack was quiet. He as I said, he had this shyness about him. He was a very sort of conflicted person. I mean, he had an awareness all his life of duality, which, as I found out when I started reading his journals, which accounts for what I experienced when I was with him, was these sort of constant sort of mood changes, attitude changes. He could be loving, he could be distant, he could be unthinkingly cruel. He was all those things. It was a constantly sort of shifting landscape. And
was it a shifting landscape in your observations of him, or was it something that you really felt personally? Like, what was he like with you?
Well, he was that way with me. He would, his moods and feelings kept fluctuating. We would be very close, and then he would, write. A lot of the time we wrote to each other because he was doing a lot of moving around at the time I met him. He was with me for a couple of months, then he went off to Tangier, and then he planned to sort of stay in Europe for a while, and I wasn't sure I would ever see him again. And then he returned in May, but just for a couple of days on his way to San Francisco, where he wanted me to meet him. So, but his plans kept changing, and he would sound very eager for me to come, and then not so eager. That his plans were changing. It was, it was always hard to kind of figure out what was going on. And of course I was a kid. He was indeed drinking very heavily. He had an extremely hard time during the early 50s when his work wasn't getting published, and he was, going around the country being kind of homeless and living on nothing, and also, exhausting himself in a way by, writing book after book in very short, concentrated periods of time. And I think he fell into depression during those periods when he wasn't writing. He was better off psychologically, I think, during the period when he was writing The Town and the City, which he worked on for about 4 years, very steadily and in a very, very disciplined way. His work was always sort of at the center of his life.
Well, and I was going to say too, when I read about Jack Kerouac, I mean, obviously there's a discipline that factors into any successful writer's life. You can't write books without it. But he's notable for being like taking an almost athletic approach to the physical act of writing. The discipline is severe, and these bursts. It's
very severe discipline, and I suspect the discipline that went into the whole act of what he later called spontaneous writing was even more severe and taxing in its way. I bet it's sort of, what it took him to get into those states of what he called transfixation, where he could do that kind of writing, the kind of writing he did Visions of Cody, for example. That remains a mystery. There was nothing about what it took to get there. And then, writing, once he discovered that way of writing, writing became for him an ecstatic act. And that was dangerous, I think. Sometimes writing is ecstatic, and sometimes writing is as much fun as going down into the mines, with a pick and a shovel. Most times it's that way. But he really, in my view, discovered a way to write a novel almost as if he were writing a poem, like seizing the moment of peak inspiration when you get this sort of rush of ideas and putting everything aside and going with it and not getting up from your chair till it was done. It's a very tough way to go.
Well, and what about, because I've read conflicting things. There's obviously like the Benzedrine use, and there's obviously like the legend of the scroll with On the Road, and all these things have sort of been mythologized at this point. But
they have been mythologized and misunderstood.
So let's clear the record. What actually went down when he sat down for one of these marathon writing sessions? I've read that when he wrote On the Road, he was actually quite sober, and it was like a...
He was, and I think that was true at other times. I think he wrote Dr. Sachs, during the time he was taking a lot of marijuana. But I think he claimed he didn't take anything but coffee when he was writing On the Road, and I think he was cold sober, while he was working on The Town and the City, and then he would save all his drinking and living up for, he would go into the city and meet with his friends and have an incredible binge, and then return to his work in his mother's apartment.
And were you a party to some of these binges?
He wasn't writing at the time that he was with me. I think he was writing a bit in his journals, and he was writing letters, and he was very very taken up, of course, once On the Road came out, with all the demands that were made on him for sort of public appearances and interviews and so on. But he had written so much before the publication of On the Road, all those books he wrote in between 1951 when he finished it and 1957 when On the Road actually came out, that he had begun to worry secretly about whether or not he had sort of written himself out. I looked at a journal of his for the fall of 1957 recently, And in it, he writes, a sentence, could I write as well as I did in 1956? He was worried about that.
Well, that's a good, and I think it's a valid concern, because when you look at literary biography, no matter who it is almost, and you look at most writers' lives, there usually is a very concentrated period of time when they do their best work, and it's usually like 10 years, it's usually, it seems to be that way. Very few writers have that kind of longevity. You think of like Saul Bellow publishing in his late 80s and stuff like that, but most writers, it's a very short burst, really.
Well, but for Jack, even in 1962, when he was in tremendous trouble because of his alcoholism, he was still able to write a very brilliant book, Big Sur, just sort of an astonishing account of his psychological state,
which he wrote very quickly. Because wasn't that book?
He wrote that very quickly. Yeah,
like a matter of days.
I think so, yeah. But what I think people are gradually becoming aware that that 3-week writing stint that produced On the Road in the spring of 1951 had been preceded by 3 years of relentless attempts to write that book, trying it this way, trying it that way, with different sets of characters, different plots. It went through all, there were just all these attempts. And of course, he had originally had the idea for writing that an On the Road in 1956, about a year before he met Neal Cassady. The original idea, which is in his journal, was that he would like to write about a man who, after recovering from a long illness, decides to, go hitchhiking across America to regenerate himself, and on the way encounters a lot of symbolic characters. And this was before he met Neal. So for a while, that the idea of the protagonist making a journey was always sort of like a solitary journey. There wasn't this companion.
But there were. It's interesting. Like some of the, I remember reading. I forget who it was. Was it Harrington, who had an idea, or there were kind of like premonitions of Neal before Jack actually met him. Do you know what I'm saying? There
were. Well, yeah. Well, he'd heard about him, but I don't know that he was too impressed by what he heard until he actually met him. In fact, he says in Visions of Cody, I thought he would be an American saint who might turn out to be somewhat boring,
Or what about? Oh, you know who it was? It was Bill Hubbard, the Texan that Kerouac met in the psych ward.
Oh yeah, that figure, that sort of wild figure who was a wanderer, this rootless person who was sort of a kind of precursor of Neal. That's true.
Right. So I guess a natural question would be, since Jack Kerouac has obviously been written about by so many different people, and there's quite a lot of literature out there about his life and his work. Why this book, and why this particular approach to it?
Well, I felt there was a lot of important stuff about Jack that really hadn't been covered. I had the desire to, first of all, to write a book that rather than focusing so much on the sensational episodes in his life. We've had plenty of books about those. That I wanted to really closely follow, his development into a writer and the way that he found his mature voice. I also had a very strong hunch that his Franco-American ethnicity was a huge factor in his life, and I wanted to understand it. Everybody knew that Jack had, came from a Franco-American family, but oddly enough, no American writer had really gone into the implications of that. So once I began getting more of an understanding of the Franco-Americans, I began to see Jack sort of in new ways and understood how much he was a product of that background.
And what did that background bring to his life and his work? What was it about all that? Like, can you describe it?
Sure. Well, in this country, although we're very close neighbors of Quebec, we really know very little about about that particular minority, the Franco-Americans. They had started leaving their sort of hardscrabble farms in Quebec in the 1880s and 1890s. They had enormous families, and their land was not producing enough food to feed them, and so they came down to the factory towns in New England in search of jobs. There was plenty of work there, and actually entire families could go to work, men, women, and children. So they came and settled into these different places in New England and in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, in Maine, in Vermont. And in these mill towns, they tended to live in rather insular communities. They unlike other groups, they really weren't looking to become assimilated. They had a whole mystique about their culture and their language and their religion, which was a kind of form of Jansenist Catholicism, and they wanted to preserve it. So even people who, were born in America or and grew up here, did not speak English well, and their children were educated in church schools that were, half the day was conducted in English, and the other half in French. So they really kept to themselves. At the same time, this was reinforced by the fact that New Englanders despised them, and there was tremendous prejudice against them. They were perceived as dumb and primitive people, and there were horrible terms for them, such as the Chinese of America or white niggers. Remember that passage in On the Road where Jack is walking in Denver and thinks sort of bitterly about his white ambitions? Well, nobody who really felt white would have coined that phrase. And so Jack, coming out of that tradition, which he didn't want to lose. I mean, he wanted to go out into America and become a writer, and in order to do that, he had to leave that community. In order to do that, he had to master English, because there was no way he could write in that Canadian French, which was a language of its own, with significant differences from classical French.
Well, yeah, and I was also struck, by how hard, by how early he knew his path. I mean, he had a sense of this from a very young age, which a lot of writers do, and then also how hard he worked to educate himself and how disciplined.
Very hard
from a young age.
I mean, as a kid, he tried to read all the books in the library. He would go there every Saturday and return home with just armloads of books, and he called this his Saturday avidities of reading. At the age of I guess he was around 15, 16, he discovered Goethe, who was immensely important to him. One thing really changed Jack's life, because the expectation had been that he would, go through high school in those French parish schools, but his family moved, and there was no room for him in the French junior high school, so he had to go into the American public school system. And there, his ability to write was recognized by his English teacher, even though Jack, I think, was quite silent in class because he wasn't yet fully fluent in English, and felt embarrassed by that. he had been registered in that school as he was in high school as a commercial student, destined for a, kind of a low-level clerical job at best.
That's it, yeah. And, it's interesting to think about how his bilingualism affected the voice that he ultimately found in his work. You know what I'm saying?
That's right.
The hard work that he had to do to learn English, had to have given him, I don't know, maybe an insight into the way the language worked that maybe a native tongue speaker might not have.
He had a tremendous sensitivity to sound, those sort of portions of Dr. Sachs where these sort of horror movie characters speak to each other. Content-wise, what they say doesn't make too much sense, but the sense is sort of carried by the music of their sentences, and I sort of feel that it captured the way Jack heard those movies when his when his knowledge of English was imperfect, and he picked up what was going on just by the way the dialogue sounded. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, it totally does.
Yeah.
And I think you talk about his youth and the major events that formed him. Obviously, his ethnicity and the bilingualism were huge factors. But we can't leave Lowell, we can't leave his youth without talking about Gerard, because it's so clear, when you reflect on his later work, and particularly on the theme of duality, that the loss of his older brother Gerard had a huge impact. And can you just talk a little bit about that part of his life?
Yes, indeed. Gerard was 9, and when he died of rheumatic fever, and Jack was 4 years old, I think, and he had been very, very close to his brother, and kind of, as Jack said, imitated him, and there was a lot of Gerard in him. It was also a very early introduction to the fact that people died and did not come back. That's a lesson you don't forget.
It's just I can't help but see such a sadness in Kerouac, and to think of a 4-year-old little boy, 4-year-old Jack Kerouac, when you lose a brother like that, and you actually witness his decline, and I mean, it's heartbreaking. It makes him such a sympathetic figure for me because of the enormous difficulty of that and how that can leave a lasting imprint.
Indeed, and my sense is that during that period, while Gerard was so ill, that Jack was to an extent left on his own by his parents, because they were so caught up in taking care of Gerard and worrying about him and so on, and then after Jack's mother really practically had a breakdown for a while after Gerard's death, and she handled it in a terrible way, because she told Jack, remember she's talking to a 4-year-old, in a sense, your brother died to save you. Ugh. I mean, that's so immediately guilt sets in. And I would, and this sort of, so Jack had this, I think, kind of survivor's guilt very early, plus the sense that we were all going to die, and the French Canadians, were their religion, their brand of Catholicism was very, very focused on death. The idea was that we were put on life, that we were put into the world to live and suffer, and there was nothing much we could do about it but accept our lot. But then when we would die, things would then get good because we would go to heaven. That was the message that they gave to sort of small children.
Yeah, I was raised Catholic, so I got a little bit of that when I was a kid.
Yeah, but it was I think it was very intense in that community. Very, very intense.
So let me ask you about his immediate family, because obviously he's had a very well documented, he had a very well documented relationship with his mother. That was probably, especially as he got into his adult life, the most enduring and important relationship in his life. But what about his?
And she really clung to him after the loss of Gerard.
Right, and so that's the thing
and
about
treated him as if he were fragile,
And it became this very dependent or codependent kind of relationship. And then what about his father and his sister? Like, where were they and what were they? Can you talk a little bit about them?
Sure. Well, his father, Jack describes his father, Leo Kerouac, as a sort of, very energetic, entrepreneurial young businessman, trying to make a good life for himself and his family, and the Kerouacs were a bit better off than a lot of other Franco-Americans in Lowell, because Leo Kerouac had his own business as a printer. He was very bright. He had a good command of English, and he could move back and forth between the French and the Anglo worlds pretty easily. He was also a man with a passion for gambling, and he was a big drinker. And his mother was a drinker too. And he made some, he spent a lot of money, lost a lot of money gambling, and by the 1930s, lost money by, borrowing money to invest in his business, and then he was kind of his business was sort of wiped out by the flood of 1936, and then the family fortunes fell drastically, and Leo no longer was his own boss. And he was a bitter man, furious at what had happened to him, angry at the town, which he called Stink Town, and he began to put all his hopes in Jack, because he believed that Jack had the makings of a football star, and saw a role for him as Jack's manager. This is what he wanted for Jack. He did not encourage him in his dreams of becoming a writer at all.
So how was Jack in his adolescence working on his writing? Like, what in these very early stages, in terms of the evolution of his voice? Like, where did he start? What were his earliest influences?
Well, one very okay. He was reading all sorts of stuff. He was reading a lot of pulp fiction and Shadow magazine, and as well as Mark Twain and Jack London and writers like that. And he began to do these sort of little newspapers. Because his father had really interested him in horse racing, and in fact he had dreams of being a jockey himself, and his father would sometimes take him to the races, and he read all the racing papers. So Jack began to create his own racing papers, which were pretty remarkable achievements for a kid. They were very carefully printed out and laid out in columns with pictures pasted in, and in them he was Jack Lewis, the publisher of the paper. He was Jack Lewis, the reporter on this whole world of the turf, and he was Jack Lewis, the owner of the winning horse, and Jack Lewis, the winning jockey. And he would report on all these horse races in the world of the track in these newspapers. So it was a whole imagined world that he they were really the kind of works of childhood genius.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to me that he was, I don't know, like your descriptions of his approach to reading and his approach to writing in high school certainly went well beyond mine.
And then he wrote a football novel while he was in high school when he was around 16.
Well, yeah, and he was selling it. Well, he wasn't only writing these things, but he was selling it to his friends and making a buck. I mean, he had
That's right. Yeah.
So he had a sense of his own value early.
Yeah. And this determination to be a writer, and he figured out that his only hope was to get out of Lowell and to get a football scholarship somewhere so that he could get a college education, which otherwise would have been beyond the family's means. So he really devoted himself to becoming an athlete.
And so talk about Horace Mann, because that seems like a pivotal moment in his development and his exposure, and it was a pivotal moment in the course of his life.
Definitely, because he had gotten a scholarship to Columbia, but it had to be preceded by a year at Horace Mann to make up the deficits in his education. And of course, he was to play football for Horace Mann while he was there. So he was uprooted suddenly from this whole insular culture he had grown up in, and among all these working class people, and transported to a very, very fancy prep school where most of the students were rich Jewish kids, and this really was an adjustment for him because his family, like many Franco-Americans, were tremendously anti-Semitic. Like all oppressed groups, they looked for another group to despise. And of course, anti-Semitism was very widespread in the country at that time.
And did Jack feel that way, or did he? It seemed like he quickly sort of. I thought there was like a kinship there, because
it was like everything with Jack. It was sort of a double thing. On the one hand, he gravitated toward these bright Jewish kids who he could discuss books with and go and hear jazz with and so on. On the other hand, he retained some of his prejudice at the same time.
Well, yeah, and I'm so struck too over not only in this particular phase of his life, but all throughout. The build up to his big breakout success with On the Road. I'm struck by the turns of fate that unfolded that enabled him to come into contact with people who could help him advance his career. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it wasn't like it was a never-ending series of lucky strokes, but there were definitely some major lucky moments for him, and he wound up in the right crowds, and he met John Cleland Holmes, and he met, he really, and he had Allen Ginsberg as his champion.
Well, that he would meet Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, at the same time, as well as Lucian Carr, who was very brilliant. That was, that really was a stroke of luck.
So what was it like? I get kind of a sense of what America and what New York City was like in these days, but it seems like to be in New York City in the mid-1940s at the end of World War II was a very good time to be there. It seemed like kind of a golden age or something to me, or am I romanticizing it too much?
No, I don't think you are. It was a period when they're beginning to be very, very exciting developments in the arts. There were a lot of very smart and gifted people around, and it really was also a time when the book was at the in the center of our culture, which is today the book really has been seriously downgraded. I don't think if a novel such as like On the Road came out today, I don't think it's in the power of a novel to cause so much change and ferment as the publication of On the Road did in 1957. It's just out of the question.
So what were the set of circumstances, just for people who might not be clued into the details of the history? Like how did Jack meet Allen and William Burroughs? Like how did that all go down, and Lucian Carr?
Well, he met them rather accidentally. because he was living with Edie Parker, who would become his first wife, a young woman who was living in the neighborhood, and with Joan Adams, who would later become William Burroughs' wife, and was the wife that he shot.
She's a tragic story. She seemed like such a bright girl, you know.
Yes, but it was hard to be a bright girl back then. You know, there wasn't much bright women could do, and she lost her way. Well, anyway, Edie happened to be taking an art class at night at Columbia, and there she met Lucien Carr, and I think she met him while Jack was away at sea, and then when he came back, she was very taken with Lucien, who was a very attractive guy, and he began dropping over at the apartment all the time to see the two women. And she introduced Jack. She introduced him to Jack, and in the West End bar. And Lucien was also staying in a dorm, Columbia dorm, on the same floor as Allen Ginsberg. So they had become acquainted, and Allen was quite smitten with Lucien, as a matter of fact. So shortly after Jack met Lucien, Allen came over to see him, and after that, Lucien's other friend from St. Louis made his acquaintance as well, and that was William Burroughs, who was living in New York at that time in the Village.
So it was just faded, and you talk about Allen being smitten with Lucien. There was a lot of people being smitten with a lot of people in this group. That's one thing that strikes me. It was a particularly incestuous. There were lots of interminglings, lots of men sharing girlfriends.
That's true.
All that stuff.
But we all, we have to looking at all this history now from my vantage point of a 77-year-old woman. I had this sort of grandmotherly feeling of, oh my God, how terribly young all these people were,
Well, I was going to ask you.
These intense friendships and crushes and so on are, very characteristic of, people in their late adolescence.
Well, I was going to ask you because, you had an intimate relationship with Jack. You spent this very, intense period of his life with him. You knew him personally. What is it like to now... and you've written another book about that part, of your life and that experience. But what is it like to...
Minor Characters.
Correct. Yeah. So, what is it like to formally biography him now, and to learn about maybe things that you didn't know previously? Were there moments where you were like, "Oh my God, I had no idea"? And, did you find yourself surprised at any point, or did you find past events coming into a new focus?
Oh, I definitely found past events coming into a new focus. I had real hunches about Jack. Well, I wrote Minor Characters back in in the 1980s. It was published in 1983, and there wasn't that much around about Jack. And over the years, I read some of the biographies that came out. And then, especially by the 1990s, more and more of Jack's writings began to be published. His letter, selected volumes of his selected letters, the portions of his journals, a collection of his early writings. Called The Top and Underwood, and I began to learn more and more about him, and there were a lot of things I felt about Jack sort of intuitively, but I didn't have the information to back all this up, and I found that a lot of my hunches were correct as I began researching this book. I wasn't. I felt actually, at this point in time, I really felt very objective. I didn't feel shocked or hurt by anything I found. I just had this tremendous curiosity about who this person was. And of course, I'm a very different person now than I was as a kid of 21, because I was really a kid.
Well, and there seems to be something too, because of Jack's he's sort of an elusive character.
He is elusive. I mean, on the one hand, he seemed like a very open person, but there were things that he really held back. He never. I don't think he ever really discussed his feelings about being Franco-American or feeling only half American with any of his, with any of the friends he made after leaving Lowell. That was something he really kept to himself, and but he had a very pervasive sense of being different and of there being no one around the New York scene who was like him, except his mother.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't help it in reading the book. I couldn't help but picture you as kind of a detective, and I can imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I can imagine that you have this brief, intense period of your life where you're interacting with this major American artist, and he's a very charismatic and elusive guy, and then it's almost like you're now going back and saying, like, what the heck happened, and trying to
and who was he?
Right, get to the bottom of it.
And it's like all this experience was sort of encoded, and I had to translate the code.
Well, and
so it was a very exciting process for me. I was it actually was the first time I had ever done archival research, and I proceeded chronologically, and I never knew what I was going to find next time I went to the library.
Well,
I really felt I was sort of living inside an unfolding life. So that was very exciting.
Well, one of the things, because there was a lot, I know, I guess a good bit, or at least the basics of the Kerouac biography, and I've read different books about him, and obviously there's kind of a prismatic view of, what tormented him. I read Subterranean Kerouac years ago, which takes takes the opinion that it was his sexuality and his repressed homosexuality, that was a big problem. You seem to disagree, that you take a different tack.
I do take a different tack. I mean, I think the sexual problem thing was very much overemphasized and sensationalized in that book.
So you think he was? I mean, Jack was heterosexual. Do you think he was bisexual? Do you have any?
I think he was heterosexual and somewhat bisexual. I recently found a letter in which it's an odd place to find this, but he was writing to the producer Jerry Wald, who was the original for Sammy Glick. In Bud Schulberg's novel, but who wanted to make a film of On the Road for a while, and he was sort of trying to explain his feeling for Neil, and he wrote, and I think this is really important. I wish I had read this while I was working on my book. That he desires women. He said, but I feel I am a man enough to love men. I thought that was a very interesting quote, don't you?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like the relationships that they all had with each other, there's an unusual level of intimacy between Alan and Neil, and Jack and Alan, and, they all sort of, they really shared a lot, not only physically.
Yeah,
like I think
intellectually and artistically,
and they weren't.
They were all influencing each other tremendously.
And it seems like too, because it's convenient to sort of imagine this time period as all of them living in the same apartment or in the same brownstone.
Yeah.
But it really, when you actually read the history, it was more like these pockets of togetherness that were extremely intense, and then they would all scatter again. It was like, this coming together and then this bursting apart, and then this coming together and this bursting apart. And, with Neil in particular, like the Neil and Jack relationship, which is so, central to the mythology and also the work itself, like that's a very interesting relationship. Like, how do you see that, having done all of this research?
Well, one way in which these men were sort of turning each other on was not physically, but with language. They all were, tremendous sort of talkers and thinkers, including Neil. And On the Road, Jack had, was able to really, he kind of could evoke the way Neil spoke and his rambling sentences and his sentence rhythms that gave so much electricity to whatever he said. But he used this to, put his own thoughts into Neil's mouth. The Neil Cassidy, the Dean Moriarty that he created was really not identical with Neil Cassidy.
Well,
nor was the Sal Paradise identical with him, with Jack.
Well, and there's so much mythology around Neil, and you can't help.
I know, and there's this endless appetite for to show to prove that that everything in Jack's work actually happened or happened just that way. And it was really, there was a basis of reality, but and there were things that Jack remembered, but also created. It was a mix, which is not so, which is the way people write fiction.
Well, and the thing too is
even autobiographical fiction. And there was also the fallacy that people believe that Jack must have kept these, notebooks in which he jotted down every single thing that ever happened to him. That he, And I really thought I would find such notebooks when I started working in the library. Instead, I found he did keep notebooks and diaries, but he didn't use them for the purpose of jotting down in detail, what had transpired that day and what Neil had said and what Jack had said, Otherppl was really created out of memory.
Well, and he had an extraordinary recall, which you mentioned.
He had an extraordinary recall, but beyond that, you have to create. You can't recall everything.
Well, and just to finish with Neil, one of the things that I find is that the popular mythology around him is that he's the angel-headed hipster. He's this sort of unbound soul that he's not encumbered by all of the white ambitions or whatever. He's kind of this ultimate free spirit. But then when you dig into it and you read more about him, he wasn't quite so saintly. You know what I'm saying? Like, he was a kind of a rough character, and I think
he was a rough character, and he was also pretty tormented and at times suicidal.
Right.
And he had all these ambitions. He too wanted to be a writer, but he couldn't. He didn't have the ability and discipline to develop his talent. He was. And he was also, haunted by the fact that he would be arrested again and put back into jail as he had been in his adolescence.
Mm. He often sounded rather despairing in his letters. Yeah, exactly. That was something that struck me, is that there was a great sadness in Neil, and then also the the abandonment of him, or the separation he had from his own mother. I don't want to take on too much of a Freudian stance, but it seems to me
that must have been terrible. After which he was raised by his father, who was a drunk who lived in a Skid Row hotel with him.
Yeah,
what kind of upbringing is that?
Well, and it makes all of his womanizing and all of his, and it was men too. It was whatever. He was just so in search of love and affection. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He was so starved for it. So it makes all of that legendary womanizing and his conning people and his seduction powers or whatever. It brings that into a new context, for me, and it makes it make more sense. And it also adds, the element of sadness.
Yeah. No, it was sad.
So I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to ask you, when it comes to Jack's voice, the voice that ultimately kind of congealed and On the Road and then developed from there, I want to ask you about Louis Ferdinand Céline, because I think this is something of a new territory. I mean, I had read before that he admired Journey to the End of the Night, which happens to be just, for the record, happens to be like my favorite novel of all time. So
it's an incredible novel, isn't it?
It's spectacular.
I read it for the first time when I was working on this book, and I was bowled over by it.
It's a wonderful book. I mean, it's dark. It's not for everybody, but to me,
and it had a tremendous influence on other writers of Jack's generation, like Mailer and Vonnegut and Heller.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those. It's one of those books that I don't think. I mean, I think writers know it and love it, but I don't think maybe the popular culture or the broader population is aware of just how influential it has been. So, like, what was it about Celine's work and particularly Journey? Because Celine's work and there's also some parallels between the evolution of Celine's voice, I think, and the way that Jack's work took off, especially when I think of like Visions of Cody and I think of Celine's later novels. Not that they're totally identical, but there is something similar in the splintering of the voice or the avant-gardeness of it. But how in particular did Journey affect Kerouac's evolution?
Well, I think it was one of the books that also showed him the power of the first-person voice in fiction, which he had been avoiding using. I mean, he always, even when he was very young and wrote in, at times in stories and things in the first, or essays in the first person, you could feel that sort of latent power. But he, for Jack at that time, he believed the way to write a novel was sort of a big canvas novel with a third-person omniscient narrator, and that's what he was writing up and trying over and over again, first in town and the city, and then up to the point where he finally sat down and wrote On the Road in the spring of '51. So, I think he was very attracted to Celine's voice, which also sort of jumped from one association to the other. And was a very French voice. I think that was very important to him, and not a sort of cultivated French voice. It was a voice of someone who had grown up in the rough streets. Another thing that was very important to Jack, I think, in that particular novel was the fact that it was the story of a man named Bartholomew and his alter ego Robinson, and they would, who he would keep encountering at different parts of his life, and who was always a bit ahead of him, and a bit more far out and more dangerous than Bartholomew was. And Jack was sort of fascinated by Robinson, and there are constant references to Robinson in Jack's journals. So I think he regarded Neil, or the Dean Moriarty character in On the Road, as his Robinson. Dean Moriarty is Sal Paradise's Robinson.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to think about the relationship that Kerouac and Ginsberg, I guess, had with Cassidy, and there's parts of me that at some moments I think to myself, like, was this parasitic? Like, and then there's also, like, I can have almost simultaneously the thought that there was something very sweet about the way that Kerouac and Ginsberg looked to Neil as a kind of teacher. He was there to almost help them unlearn all of the structured institutional learning that they had been subjecting themselves to in school and particularly in college. He was almost like he had this self-taught intelligence that they envied or really admired. But then there's also a part
Neil
of
looked to them as teachers, as the guys who they were the pros at writing.
Right.
You could maybe give him some tips.
But did you ever think to yourself when you were doing this research? Do you ever feel like it was maybe just the case where maybe Kerouac didn't love Neil as much as we might think, but that he was using him because he found him valuable to his work, or is that a misreading?
I think it was all, he had a real love for Neil, but he also loved him because he was such a source for his fiction.
Yeah, he's just the ultimate character.
You know, and writers are pretty ruthless about using the people they love in their work.
I don't know anything. I don't know what you're talking about, Joyce.
You don't know what I'm talking about.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. So, is there a?
I mean, it's kind of essential. You know, a lot of beginning writers, especially people who write memoirs, get really hung up on this point. You know, if I write something, is it going to hurt so and so? But in a sense, the writer has to sort of brutally thrust that consideration aside and go forward.
Well, it's like the old Norman Mailer line where he says, "A writer who's afraid to offend people is like a surgeon who's afraid to cut." That's it.
Right.
So, with regard to the voice and like what Jack ultimately arrived at, what is it? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, what is it in that voice in particular? I think On the Road, even though he might have had, I've read that he, didn't have the highest opinion of it or didn't consider it among his best work later, but that was obviously the book that had the greatest resonance. What do you think it was? Like, can you pinpoint it?
It had a particular sort of music, and it was the most natural way for Jack to write. You know, he had been resisting writing in that fashion, as I've said, and he also. Because it was a first-person voice, and it was sort of direct and sort of non-literary. He'd been trying to be very literary before writing these sort of Melvillian novels. He came. It's my conviction that he came to this voice that he would use in On the Road. Finally. About a month before he actually started writing it, he had been casting around desperately for how to approach his road novel, and then and for a voice for it as well, and he wrote a novella in French. It's really, he had written some more fragmentary things in French. This is a whole, almost finished novella called La Nuit est ma femme, or that means The Night is My Woman, or Les Travaux de Michel Breton, which means The Jobs of Michel Breton. And it was, directly sort of autobiographical novella about a guy, a Franco-American guy, who is supported either by his mother or his wife, and is an unsuccessful writer, and looking back on his, passionate desire to become a writer, and all the, terrible jobs he sort of had to take and walk out on along the way, whereas, writing was the thing he most wanted to do. And it's a terrific piece of writing, and I'm so much hoping that it'll be translated someday and published, because it's a key piece of Kerouac writing, and I think that voice of this Franco-American in that book led directly to Sal Paradise's voice, where he began to let some of the French sound back into his English.
Well, I was going to say, it sounds like a key piece of information there is that he wrote it in French.
Yeah.
And there's also other mentions in the book, years before he wrote On the Road, where, you're reading through his journals and you'll catch like a page or a paragraph where you can really hear the music that ultimately found its way into On the Road. And it strikes me as interesting that, writers can struggle for years and years and years to get their own method, which everyone sort of has to arrive at. And it's sort of tantalizing and kind of heartbreaking to see that, like, oh my God, 8 years before he actually found it, he sort of had it, at least for a page.
He had it, but he didn't have the confidence in it. It wasn't the way he thought you were supposed to write.
And so did he have, when he finally did allow himself to write that way, was it confidence, or do you think that it was finally just like, fuck it, I'm going to do it. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, where do you think he came down there, and how did it really, I don't know, explode out of him?
I think that voice sort of carried over in his head when he sat down to finally said, okay, I'm going to put down on paper what happened, with Neil and me in the years that I was on the road, rather than fictionalizing it. He had been doing these very fictionalized versions of the story of going on the road and the relationship with Neil and other characters. He'd even the summer of 1950, while he was in Mexico City, he had written a version of On the Road, in which the characters were two young French Canadians, a boy named Wilfred Boncoeur and his cousin, who go on the road together, and with cousin as cousin as sort of the guide and leader of the two.
Well, it's sort of it's important because, again, the mythology with On the Road and the writing of this thing in 3 weeks. Like, even if he did sit down, and you can, just for the record, he did sit down and write On the Road in that 3-week period.
He did indeed. He did indeed.
But it's important to note that there were many attempts at writing the book, lengthy attempts, and it's actually extraordinary that he kept on and didn't just can the whole idea, because he really seemed to be getting nowhere with it, and of course he has this reputation of someone who never revised and so on, but actually to sort of write a good many pages of something and then cast them aside and then try again and then say, no, that's not it, and cast that aside. I can't think of a more brutal form of self-criticism and revision than that. Yeah, exactly. And it just, it makes me feel so much better, because if he had just sat down in one shot and written that thing in 3 weeks, it would be depressing for me personally. Yeah.
I mean, there were elements in On the Road of things he had written before in all these other versions, moments of epiphany and so on, some stuff from his notebooks, but as I said to you, he really most of the time wasn't recording his experiences in any detail.
Well, I could sit here and ask you questions all day. It's all very fascinating. And the book is wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
I congratulate you on it, and I thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Well, it's been great fun talking to you. It really has been a pleasure.
All right, folks, there you go. That is Joyce Johnson. Her book, once again, is called The Voice Is All, The Lonely Victory of Jack Kerouac. It is available now from Viking. You can find her online at joycejohnsonbooks.net, and you can find her on the Facebook, too. And please be sure to check out Fight Song, the new novel by Joshua Moore, available now from Soft Skull Press. It is the February selection of the TNB Book Club, so don't forget to go join the Nervous Breakdown Book Club over at thenervousbreakdown.com. Thank you to Kill Rock Stars for all the great music. Be sure to check out killrockstars.com. I think that's it for now. I am going to go spend the rest of my day doubting myself, doubting the contents of my brain, and I am then going to doubt my decision to doubt. And when that is done, I am going to doubt my decision to doubt my decision, if you know what I mean. Please remember that T.S. Eliot missed military service in World War I due to a hernia, and that William Faulkner's middle name was Cuthbert. Thanks for listening. As always, I'll be back on Wednesday with another show, just a couple of days. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe for free at iTunes. You can subscribe to this program for free at iTunes if you haven't done that yet. If you're a Stitcher person, you can subscribe for free there. And better yet, you can get the free official app, the Otherppl app. Please do that. You're missing out if you don't do that. Your life is not complete until you get the Otherppl app for your iPhone, your iPad, your iPod Touch, your Android device, whatever you have. The app is free, so please acquire it. Okay, I'm gonna leave now. I'm gonna go away. I'm gonna go look for my voice. I feel like I need to find my voice. I need to locate it. Where is it? My true voice, the voice that will speak to multitudes, the voice that will resonate through the ages, unencumbered by the burden of needless doubt, the voice that will know when to shut the fuck up.